Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews, and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tygers.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture Podcast. I'm Pete Tygers. As ever, I try and make the content of these podcasts varied. Trying to always sort of look down new avenues and explore new places to make sure that the podcast stays fresh, interesting and relevant to you. And this is one I've been thinking about a lot, and it's quite a emotive one as well. So I hope you'll find this one interesting. As ever, I've not scripted this. It's called My Life in 10 Fly Rods. And like I say, it's quite an emotive subject for me. We go to some interesting areas and interesting places with it. But all I've got is the list. I wrote down a list of 10 fly rods and how they sort of coincided with my life, what they meant at that particular time, and thought I'd take it from there. So I'm sort of speaking, I guess, really from the heart and experience of my life, really. So I really hope you find this one interesting. I'm really looking forward to talking to you a little bit about it and my life and how fishing has been affected by it, really, and influenced by it in such a great way. So what I thought I'd do is kick off with my first rod, and it is a rod from Bob Church. And it was a 9.5 foot 7-weight rod. I can't quite remember what the name of it was, but I sense it was named after one of the Bristol reservoirs, and it might have been Blagden or Chew, but I can't quite remember now at the time. But this was really a rod for me when I realised that I was getting serious about fishing. Fishing has always been in my life, but it was something when I was younger you sort of did along with a lot of other things, and I played a lot of sport when I was younger, a lot of football, hell of a lot of cricket, and fishing was sort of intertwined in with that. And I grew up in Essex, and really at the time we had obviously Hanningfield Reservoir, which was a famous location for trout fishermen, but there were a lot of carp lakes that we could strap a rod to our bikes and head over to. And the school I went to when I went used to shut at 3:00. We had a short lunch time, and we'd finish at 3. And if you were inclined to do your homework, and if anyone younger's listening, please do your homework. But I was more interested in going out and either playing football, cricket, or perhaps doing some fishing too. So it was always sort of there. And I remember those sort of times where you could buy a rod from the places like Woolworths. And this sort of made me think a little bit more as well about the tackle shops that, you know, you'd have a local tackle shop that sort of sold just about everything, and there might be some camping stuff in there, and invariably there'd be that little corner somewhere with some flies and some odd bits and pieces that could get you going. And then latterly I kind of remember, again, living in Essex, that I'd head over to Hertfordshire, and there was a shop called Simpson's at Turnford, run by or owned by Jack Simpson, and in the game fishing department was Phil Barker as well. And I used to love going up there and chatting to them, having a look at stuff. And, you know, there's so many products that were coming new to the market. And even then, you know, we're talking obviously pre-internet times then, and you found out via magazines what was coming, or the grapevine of what was coming into a fishing tackle shop as well. And that's how you sort of learnt about stuff in those days. And you could go out there and cast a rod. And, you know, there's so many, like I say, products that I remember really, really well that suddenly came to the market, and you learnt about them chatting to Phil or Jack about it. So the Bob Church, obviously 9.5 foot 7-weight, and where I was living, that was your sort of standard lake rod, and I used it, and I caught fish on it. And I remember catching the first fish on that rod, and I had a sinking line, and it was a new fishery. It was called, at the time, it was called Norton Fishery, and I headed over there and caught some fish, and that was really a wonderful time to really explore and love fly fishing so much. And it was there that I suddenly discovered what it really, really meant to me, and all the other sort of pastimes fell by the wayside, really. So that was the first one to kick off with. The next one is, if you're into distance casting, I think you'll probably know the name Mike Marshall. And again, at the time, really getting fly casting lessons, because I realised at this stage that I could really sort of throw a line out there, and I think throw a line was probably the best description. And there wasn't really a good understanding on my behalf of what was required to be a good fly caster so that I could get my fly from A to B efficiently and effectively. So I think at Norton I'd seen that Mike had put some cards or something in there, and he was offering fly casting down at Brentwood. So I had some lessons with him and learnt a hell of a lot, and he'd bought a book which I devoured and really, really, really enjoyed reading. It was a really interesting look at fly casting and gave me all the information that I needed to know. But he also sold some rods as well, and I seem to recall I bought a 9'7" weight from him, and that was, I think they were on Ryobi blanks, and I seem to recall that he ground those himself as well. And at the time, I was starting to be aware of rivers, and like I say, there weren't many in the area that I could go fish, but I'd recently heard of a club in Hertfordshire again called the Amwell Magna, and I managed to get in there. And it's interesting, on one of the, or two of the previous podcasts really, that two of the guests are members of that club. Fergal Sharkey, who I remember having a chat about an epic spinnerful we'd both experienced on the chalk streams, but also Matthew Wright as well. And I think he's chairman of the club now, and it was a wonderful little club down in Hertfordshire, but I needed a rod to fish it. So Mike said, well, I've got an 8'5" weight, and that may almost seem a strange and heavy line weight these days, but bearing in mind there weren't so many lighter line rods around at the time, so that was just standard sort of rod. And I know in a lot of places an 8.5 foot for a 5-weight rod is still probably the considered choice, but at the time I didn't have a lot of choice, and I went for one of those and caught some fish down there. So I joined, as I say, Amwell Magna, and it's been interesting to see the work that they've done down there and how the fishery has blossomed so much over the years. I'd love to go back one day and visit it, but I learned so much about river fishing there and approach and everything that went with it. And I was a member for a number of years, and interestingly, again, I've not scripted this, and I'm thinking about, it was one of the first times I fished bamboo as well, and I bought a sharp Scotty rod and took that down there and caught some fish there as well. One of the things I always remember is the epic adder hatch there, and I'm petrified of snakes. And they did used to get a few there, and I hit the perfect storm one September. And I don't know if they were sort of moving to start thinking about hibernating, or it was one of the last warm days and the grass was rustling everywhere, and I was absolutely petrified. I love the outdoors. I love everything that comes along with being out in the outdoors, except snakes. And I think that's probably why I enjoyed fishing down in New Zealand so much, because there weren't any snakes down there. But that was really the sort of beginning where I was starting to shift, I guess, from still water fishing more to moving water. And that was a sort of a pivotal moment. It was a pivotal club for me as well, that it was just such great fun to fish. I really, really enjoyed it. I met some really nice people there and really, really liked it. And it was only, for me, I guess, 35-minute drive as well, which worked perfectly. And it was one of those things I think that was meant to be, but I really, really enjoyed fishing it. And like I say, speaking to Fergal and hearing that all of the conservation work that's gone on there, and at the time they used to stock it, and I think they're relying pretty much now on wild fish, which is really exciting to see. So perhaps one day I'll get to visit back there. But that was a really interesting place to fish, a fun place to fish, and I fished it with the Mike Marshall rod. And I remember actually one time taking Mike down. I said, "Hey, thanks for the rod. Do you want to come and have a fish?" And I remember us standing in a pool trying to figure out some rising fish, and I think we got lucky with a few of them as well. So very, very happy memories of that. So what we're going to do now is move on a little bit further. And again, we're way pre-internet times, but I was lucky that Emma bought me a copy of John Gierach's Trout Bum many, many years ago. It was when it had just come out, and I just devoured it. It was, as I'm sure for many people, it was a life-changing book. And it seemed to me that I just had to, he's based in Colorado, and it seemed to me that I just had to make a pilgrimage out there. And so I did. And I went to Colorado and I fished the White River. I stayed at a lodge called Elk Creek Lodge. In those days, I had no idea how you found out about fishing. I didn't know anyone in the US who fished. I didn't really know what I was heading for. So I just had to go and book myself. I went on my own, and I booked myself into a lodge. And again, this ties nicely. It's come up in a previous podcast with one of the guests, John Hazlitt, who was a guide over there at the time as well. And it was just really, really good fun. I enjoyed it, a variety of mixed fishing and being able to catch cutthroat trout and wild rainbows was really, really exciting. And loved every single second of it over there, and that's where I think my love affair with the American Midwest really began, with the books of Gierach and getting the opportunity to fish these streams. I don't know if he's ever fished the White River, but may have done, may not have done, but it gave me a sense of what he was describing in those books and the dry fly fishing that went with it. And I still remember the place very, very fondly. I think it sold, and I think they built a load of other sort of houses and things on there that went for huge sums of money. So I don't think it's there as I remember it, but it was really exciting. But I bought the Scott Eclipse from a store in the US in Grand Junction in Colorado, and they shipped it to the lodge. So I picked it up there. I bought it unseen. It was a deeper bending, more progressive rod, but I really, really enjoy fishing it. I remember it was a 9 foot for a 5 weight. I teamed it. Monic had just come to the marketplace at the time, and they'd bought this sort of clear floating line. So I thought it might be fun to use one of those out there. I'd sort of, in my mind, built all of these ideas of how the river would be, how spooky they were, and the Monic line would be perfect for that. Of course, it still leaves casts a shadow anyway, but it was really great fun to fish, and I really, really enjoyed it and loved every second of it. So that was a wonderful, wonderful trip that I thoroughly enjoyed. So next up, we're going to the G. Loomis GLX, and I'm sure many people have owned and loved these rods. I was still sort of flirting with a bit of stillwater fishing. It was a 9.5 foot 7 weight rod, and I'd bought a video from Simpsons, actually. I remember picking it up there, and it was made by Pete Cockwell, and it showed about fishing small still waters, stalking great big rainbow trout, and he did it at Avington, I think Chalk Springs, and it was a really, really wonderful video, and I really, really enjoyed it. I think the music and one of the guests was Gary Brooker, who was in the 60s group, if you're old enough to know, Procol Harum, who recorded A White Shade of Pale. And Pete and this video had such a massive impact on me about how to think about my fishing and how to think about many other things as well. And again, funnily enough, without me even thinking about it, Pete's been a guest on this podcast, and it was lovely to catch up with him at Diva Springs and talk to him about it. But he still remains a massive influence on me and my fishing and how I think about fishing as well. And I caught many, many fish on that rod. I've still got it. And he put my name on the rod, so there's no way I'm going to get rid of that. And I even fished Diva with Pete many years ago, and my friend took a photo of the two of us together, and Emma got the picture blown up, my wife, and sent it off to Pete, and he signed it, and it's still is with me, that picture. It means a hell of a lot to me, and he's just a wonderful man. A wonderful video, and yes, meant a hell of a lot to me. So that's a rod I'm never going to part company with, and I think that's one that'll always stay with me. So we're going to move on a little bit now, and this is where I'm starting to fish Devon a hell of a lot more now. And I talked about when I bought the Mike Marshall rod, the 8'5" weight, there weren't many lighter line rods there. And I discovered that Sage had bought one, and it was a really funky, different, interesting design. And it's called the SPL-CA, and it's an 8'1" one-weight rod. And this was a really revolutionary design, that the reel was attached to the butt of the rod, and I think the term they used was center axis, and everything was perfectly balanced. So the reel was attached to the rod. It came with a fly line as well, and it was sort of a bit no man's land really with people and fly anglers. These things are really only useful for high days and holidays, and when the wind isn't blowing, and that's the only time you can use it. But I found you could use it a hell of a lot. And I managed to buy the rod from, I think it was from John Norris, actually. It was a second-hand rod, but it had been really, really lightly used. And again, in those days, you'd started to see mail order shopping be available. And one of the trailblazers, I guess John Norris must have been one of them, but one of the trailblazers was Sportfish. And this is where I learnt about all these rods and these wonderful American rods that were coming to the marketplace that I knew nothing about. And it still is the case with many people, you know, when those Sportfish or John Norris or whoever it may be brochures come through the post, or the Orvis as well, that I still eagerly look through them. And even as somebody who's worked in the industry, I still get excited to see that stuff and see what's out there and what's come new that perhaps I haven't known about. But they're just fun to always have close to hand and have a look through. And I remember those early Sportfish brochures, that they weren't so thick at the time, but they had some really interesting stuff in there. And like I say, stuff I'd sort of dreamed about owning. And I think that's where I sort of first became aware of those American brands of rods, really, via that. And this is obviously, I'd bought the Scott previous to that, but the reason I bought the Scott, going back a little bit, was that they were made in Colorado as well. So I wanted to sort of join all of the dots up before my trip. So that's why I chose that one. But I'm just thinking about it then. But that brochure and those brochures that came out at the time were great fun. But yeah, I was fishing this rod a hell of a lot. I was using it a lot on the small streams of Devon, found it was fantastic. And the hatches probably were more prolific then, although I'm just in from the river, and I've had a wonderful morning on the river with just me and the dog, and just casting a dry fly and catching a few fish as well. And it feels, I don't know if these things are cyclical or not, but you know, in those days you could just tie on pretty much a black fly and bring a fish up to the surface relatively easily. It seemed to be an easy thing to do in those days. And I remember when I was heading around Crediton, and there was a pet store in there, and again, it was one of those sorts of things that sold some odd fishing stuff, and they had piles of flies there, and I'd walk into the pet shop there and see that the black gnats there were hardly any of those, yet the other flies, there were lots of them left over. So that gave me a massive clue. But that rod now is still pretty old now. It must be 20 plus years old, and it still has a place in my rod arsenal. And it felt, when companies were bringing those lighter weight rods, I'd sort of follow that trend and buy them and try them. And I got the SPL-CA out again and cast it just in the garden. I thought, wow, this does feel a little bit older. But the really interesting thing for me was that I'd seen that recently that Rio have been designing more so lines to go for specific fishing situations. And they brought the Creek line, and I thought, I tell you what, I'm going to try one of these. And I put it on there. I bought a one weight and put it on, and it's really brought that rod back to life for me, so much so that I'm fishing it all the time now. So that is, if I'm fishing a small stream, and, you know, like I've said in previous podcasts, really, that I do like to fish bamboo rods, but there's something cool about going out to fish a one weight on our little streams, and I still like to bring that out. And that has become my light line rod again, which it almost feels as though I've gone full circle again, and really, really enjoyed every aspect of it. So yeah, that SPLCA, I'm never going to sell it. I'm told they're hugely collectible now. I use it, and again, it comes back to the bamboo rods as well, and we'll probably come on to those at some stage. But there's no point having a rod that's sitting in the cupboard. If you're not using it, get rid of it or use it. And, you know, these things aren't investments for me. They are things that I fish and I enjoy. And I watched a film recently, actually, on YouTube, and it had Mike Clark, who will be featuring a little bit later in my rod selection. And he said there's no point, you know, if people have put a lot of effort into building a rod, there's no point it sitting doing nothing. So please fish it. So I've always listened to that, and I've always believed that. So yeah, collectible. Am I going to get rid of it? Never. I know Theo Pike is a big fan of that rod. He has one too, and I hope one day, actually, that soon that we get to fish those together at some stage. So next, we're going to move on. We're staying with Sage, but we're going on to their rod, the SP series. It was a 6-weight rod, and the reason I bought this was that I'd started to move into working in fly fishing full time, and I was incredibly lucky that I happened to meet Nick Hart when I was bass fishing, and he asked me what I was doing, and a conversation ensued, and I ended up working for him as an instructor. And I'd met, well, taking it back a little bit where I started working for him, I remember I went to a show, I think it was called Go Fishing at the NEC. And I'd literally been working for him, I think, 2 or 3 days, and we went up there. And there was a casting pool, and some guys had been doing demos and things there, and the show was starting to wind down. And he introduced me to Gary Champion and Vic Knight, who are both imposing men, very fine casters. And Nick introduced me and said he's working with me, and they said, handed me a rod and said, go on then, show us what you can do. And that's probably one of the most nerve-wracking things I've ever had to do, because we were chatting about fishing, we were chatting about life, and I knew it was coming. I knew I was going to have to cast. And so I did, and they thought I was a little bit raggedy in part, but there was something there which I guess Nick had seen as well. And so I went on to learn about the exam, taking the exam, the basic exam, the level 2 instructor exam at the time. It was at the time a really, really difficult one to pass. I think the pass rate was incredibly low, and I got through with the skin of my teeth. Nerves got to me, I'll be brutally honest about it. It meant so much to me that I just got incredibly nervous, but managed to get my way through that and decided I wanted to take it further. And I'd been sort of watching guys casting at game fairs, and I remember watching these guys with the AAP guy qualification, and I just wanted to see if I could throw a line with them and eventually take the exam. And that was probably a couple of years after I'd taken the level 2, and I remember it was a game fair at Beaver Castle, and I was sort of teaching beginners and enjoying that. I managed to drop some sunglasses in a lake when Steve Peterson said good morning to me, and I'd had my glasses on top of my baseball cap, so I thought I'd be a gentleman and tipped my cap to him and took it off and flipped my sunglasses into the bottom of the lake, which I never found again. But that's a side story to that. And I went over at lunchtime and I saw Vic, I saw Gary Cox, and I think there was Martin Armstrong, and said, can I have a cast with you? And because I wanted to see how my casting stood up against these guys. And I knew if I was doing something wrong, if there was a weakness, they'd tell me about it. So I thought that was the best way to actually do it. And it seemed to work pretty well. And they handed me a Sage SP 9'6" weight, and that was it. And I was taken by the rod. And it wasn't as Sage were at the time were bringing out stiffer rods. I think we probably had the RPL Plus and then the SP Plus, which was a different rod. It was built off a different mandrel and was a lot stiffer. And that's what the TCR went on to become, really. But this was more of a moderate action. I think SP stands for smooth performance, but I'm sure somebody can correct me on that. And it was just a great all-round rod. And I spent so many hours casting, working on my casting. I had at the time, the line to put on it was the Snowbie XS. And again, we touched on that with Simon Kidd in a previous podcast. And I spent many, many hours. I wore out fly lines, practicing all the aspects and elements of the cast. And yeah, I found this rod. There's a nice backstory to that as well, that I just couldn't find one anywhere. It'd been out of production, and whenever they came up on eBay or places like that, they went really quickly. And I found one in the States. It was a 2-piece one. It was a little bit raggedy, but I got that one to play with. And then a 3-piece one came up on eBay, and I bought that. And that was a fabulous, fabulous rod. And yeah, I spent so many hours practicing and refining my casting, thinking about my casting, and really every morning, when I woke up, it was one of the first things I could think about, right, okay, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And I ended up taking the exam, and it was a really, I think, again, I talked about the nerves in the level 2, and I think any other day around that, I'd have probably bottled it or got so nervous. But I happened to get up the morning of the exam, and we were down on the river. The guys who were taking it with me have still remained friends after many, many years now. I was there casting, and I felt really, really good. And the exam went, I think, really, really well. One of the assessors said to me, yeah, you walked the casting part of it. But it was a fascinating and really great experience to be able to do that. And exams have never been my thing. School was never really my thing. And even the exams at school really weren't for me. And so I think that's probably why I used to get a little bit nervous ahead of those things. But thankfully I passed it. And that rod was a really pivotal part of it for me, to be honest. I really, really enjoyed casting it. I didn't fish with it a great deal. I think I just sort of kept it as that rod that I used to pass my exam, and I subsequently sold it. And I sort of kicked myself a little bit about that, but we'll see what happens further down the line. I've still got a 9'5" weight version of it, which I may even bring out and fish. I keep meaning to at some stage, but perhaps that'll come out and fish. So that's number 6, I think it is, the Sage SP 9'6" weight in a 3-piece, and it was the rod that took me really to another casting level, really. And I should mention about this, actually, that within these associations, I think externally people think, right, well, these are just casting people, but they're not. They're amazing fly anglers as well. You may not see a lot of it in social media or other places, but these guys can really fish and love fishing just like we do. And I think sometimes that may be lost out there somewhere, and they're just interested in standing in a field casting. And from my experience, having seen it from the inside, that's certainly not the case. So, special rod for me. And I think I passed that when I was 39, I think. And the reason I say that was that my next rod choice is the Mike Clark South Creek rod. And that is a really incredibly special rod for me. I was turning 40, and Emma, my wife, had saved up and ordered me a rod from Mike Clark. And if you, again, come back to John Gierak, you'll know, if you've read his books, one of the rod builders he fishes with a lot and uses his rod, and has a range from Mike as well So you'll know Mike Clark and South Creek from there. And he's based out in Lyons, Colorado. And Emma told me coming into my 40th, look, this is what I've done. And she said to me, okay, why don't you go out there and pick it up? And so I did that, and I headed over there with my good friend Ray, and we stayed in Lyons. And the very first morning we arrived late and woke up ridiculously early, and the St. Vrain was running by the cabins that we were staying in, and we were up at silly o'clock catching some fish on dry flies as well, which was great fun. And then we went down into Lyons itself and had breakfast, and it turns out it was the place where John Girac has breakfast, or used to have breakfast, or still does a lot of the time. And when you're sort of out of the main sort of cities, one of the interesting things is that people ask you where you're from, and often they think you're Australian for some reason. It might be my Cockney accent, I don't know what it is, but we got talking, and the lady serving us breakfast said, hey, what are you doing here? And we said we were fishing, and it was kind of cool that she said, hey, do you know John the fisherman? And we sort of nodded and said, yeah. But it turned out he was out of town when we were there. But the plan was to go to Mike Clark's shop, pick up the rod. And because we'd travelled such a long way to see them, that he shut the shop in the afternoon, and we went to go fish the St. Vrain. But it was really cool. He said, hey, would you like to meet AK Best? So we said, yep. And so he came over and we hung out and we talked about fishing and all sorts of things that went with that. And we hit the St. Vrain in the afternoon, and that was amazing. And Kathy, who works with Mike as well, came along, and we just had an amazing time. And it was such a good time that Mike said, right, okay, well, I'm not opening the shop tomorrow. We're going out for the day. And they took us to a secret stream, and we got to fish that together. We had a really good breakfast. We headed high. They told us to take some paracetamol, I think it was, or whatever it was, Anodin, to thin our blood because we were fishing high. But we just had the most wonderful time fishing with them, and it was an amazing trip. And we travelled everywhere around Colorado, fished so many places. I'm sure this will come up in a podcast and parts of it of elsewhere. And I'm probably going to get Ray on there at some stage, and we'll talk about some of the trips and the mishaps we've got up to while we've been fishing around the world together. But it was a really amazing trip. The rod was phenomenal. It's beautifully put together. It's got Emma's name on the bottom. The name of the rod is called the Bray Special, after a wonderful little stream down here in Devon. And I got to speak to him on the phone when I was ordering it. I said, Mike, just make your signature rod. And it's a 3-piece rod, so it means I can travel with it. Which is great news. I fish it. Like I said on the previous rod selection, that he said that you want to be fishing these rods and it's probably worth some money. I don't look at it from that point of view because it means so much to me and it's not going to mean the same to somebody else. So I fish it now. I enjoy fishing it, and it's just wonderful fun to fish, and I thoroughly enjoy fishing it. It was a memorable trip. It's a memorable rod. Colorado's just amazing. I think sometimes it gets lost behind Montana and perhaps some of the other places as a major fishing destination, but I love it, and we fished many of the big name rivers and thoroughly enjoyed every second of our trip there. It was great, and like I say, it's just a fabulous rod and a wonderful way to celebrate my 40th, so I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I wanted to stick with bamboo for a bit. And the reason for that is that I got to meet, and he's been on the podcast with us, Luke Bannister, and a real gentleman in both senses of the word as well. And I got to meet him at a show. It's the Devon County show, actually, and I do some fly casting demonstrations there. And if you ever want to see a show arena at a farming show and everything emptied quickly, mentioned fly fishing, and we used to try everything to keep people entertained or interested, but sadly it didn't work so well. And the difficult thing from that as well for me was that it was peak of mayfly, and I thought I'm spreading the fishing word, so that's really, really cool. But I was thinking about the mayfly and the spinner fall in the evening and everything else. But I'd used to see Luke at these shows, and we'd talk about bamboo rods, and I'd bought one rod, and we talked about tapers more from his side, but would cast rods. And I think my feedback helped a tiny little bit in the process, and I really enjoyed talking to him about those. And I remember at one of those shows that we. It really had got to me that year, and I thought, I'm missing out. This is an epic hatch, and I'm missing it. So I said to him, you're not sleeping at your van. Let's make up some sort of excuse. Leave a little bit early, hit the river, stay at mine, and we'll be back for the show the next morning. So we did exactly that, and we had a great time on the river. The mayfly was everything we hoped it would be. We had one of those wonderful moments where somebody joined us as well and hooked into a nice fish that took them into a snag, which was, I'll never forget that moment. And that was really, really cool. But the reason I mentioned that as well was that the rod that he brought, and I'm very fortunate to have number 2 of the Superfast series that he brought. And this was a real groundbreaking rod, I think, that was the crossover where people like myself who were starting to be really interested in collecting bamboo rods and have moved from graphite to bamboo. And this Superfast it bridged the gap really, really well. And I think it's a real landmark rod in modern rod making, in the sense that it was more natural to move from graphite and cast this. It felt kind of familiar, yet had all of everything that you'd want from a bamboo rod, but didn't feel as deep loading. And, people often say, oh, well, it's like I've got an old rod from whenever it was, 1920, 30, 40, whenever it might be. This bridged that gap really, really well. And it's funny that while I'm recording this, I've been out this morning, the mayfly I've been on, and I fish with it. And I probably, when I wrote this list, I was thinking subconsciously about it and took it out, and I put a 4-weight Rio Gold on it, and it was just a sublime cast and sublime to fish with. And I just really, really like it. And again, it's a really, really special rod for me. And it is, for Luke, I think it has been great. And on previous podcasts, we talked about a rod. He's got a new taper coming, and I cast it, and I really, really like it. And I've ordered one of those for my collection as well. That's a 3-piece, so that if I do, and when we can go abroad, I can take that rod with me. And it's coming back to, again, that I'm just so enjoying fishing and casting these rods. It feels as though I've come full circle. It feels organic. It feels really great to be fishing these rods, and I'm really enjoying them. Graphite will still always be close to me. There's no reason why not. And latterly, glass has been as well. But there's something I'm really enjoying about fishing. I think it's probably the way I'm fishing now as well, that I'm waiting for a rising fish. So I'm not making thousands of casts. I'm just waiting, and I'm getting myself into position and casting that. But also the ability to play the fish as well. And even, a lot of what our Devon fish are like, they're not particularly large generally. That even those feel fabulous on bamboo rods as well. But the Superfast is a really interesting innovation. I think we're starting to see a little bit more of that within the bamboo community, which is good. And it seems as though, given everything that's happened with lockdown and everything, people seem to be looking at their fishing differently now. And the glory shot and nymphing the whatever out of a pool, that's fine. There's times for that as well, and I do it, so I'm not knocking it in that sense. But to me, it feels as though people are looking at fishing differently now, and the way they approach it and the way they address it. And it's not the glory shot that means that you've had a good day on the water. And hopefully in some small way, that the way we look at things with Fly Culture, with this podcast and everything else, that's how I feel about it. And I never would impose my view on anyone. But it's nice when you get feedback from people who feel the same, or, oh, I've just bought my first bamboo rod or my first glass rod, or I hit the river for the first time and I saw some really cool stuff. That's really cool. And that, I think, is a massive motivator for me as well. So long may that continue. You know, with Fly Culture now, we've put 12 issues out now and extremely proud of those. And we've tried to go down a different route with it and try and be a little bit different with it, and not try and share aggressively, but just let people find us gently. And it seems to be happening. It seems to be people are finding us and liking what we're doing with fishing and how we're feeling about fishing. And it's really cool to be a part of a movement that appears to be out there that's a little bit different and has moved away. So that's really, really cool. And so for the next choice, we're going to look at neuronymphing. And I've been lucky enough to enjoy it and been doing this for a long number of years now. And I've tried many, many rods over that time. Notable mentions must go to the Sage ESN, which I think is excellent. I've got at the moment a Solderini nymph rod, which I think is fabulous too. I'm really enjoying that. And I've tried many over the years. And I think for me, what I like about them is that softer tip and that ability to play fish with it. And that's been a real turning point for me. And I find my hookup and landing success rate is really high as a result of that, even when it's sizable fish as well. And like I say, I've tried many over the years. Probably where I was really sort of interested in a dedicated out and out nymphing rod, I'd had a few beforehand, but was the Maxia MX range. Maxia are a company over in Spain, and I first was aware of those when my friends Jim Williams and Warren McCarthy were using them. Jim had an association at the time with Maxia, and so I got to try them, and I thought, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And they had a 10-foot 2-weight rod, which I bought, and then I subsequently, for some reason, I sold that one. But I wanted a slightly shorter one for a stream I was fishing in the West Country for winter grayling. So I bought a 9'4" 3-weight, and that was perfect for the stream that I fished. And subsequently, I took a group down to Montana, and we were fishing out there. The thought about fishing at the time, it's obviously subsequently changed, was having a great big indicator and a heavy fly. And the guide at the time, Eric, I said, what time do we finish? And he sort of said, right, well, it'll be about 5-ish. I said, look, if we've got half an hour. And I showed him, because I'd been catching a lot of fish that day. And I remember 3 of us, it may have even been 4 of us. It was he, myself, Gavin and Darren, I think, and we just took it in turns using this rod to fish some pools, and it was phenomenal. And you could see how his eyes lit up when he saw it for the first time, and that was a really, really special moment. I've also played with the rod, that particular rod, with the fly line as well, and it will cast a fly line. In fact, it's quite a rocket launcher, and I found on that trip I was using it a hell of a lot. But for nymphing those waters at the time, like I say, subsequently it has become increasingly and more so popular in the US as well. But at the time, I don't think many people, bar the competition experts, obviously, in the likes of Lance Egan, etc., were doing that sort of thing. I don't think so many people were used to it, and it sort of opened up water that I think certainly Eric hadn't sort of thought about before. So I sort of left him a Euro leader. I certainly didn't leave him the rod, but I left him a Euro leader to have a play with, and I think he really got into it as well. So that was really cool. But I've really enjoyed fishing those rods, and it's made me also think about the rod action. I've talked about it many times on this podcast, so apologies, but the rod action and its application for playing fish as well. And that has, I think, for me, probably come from that more than anything else. But they've been great fun to fish with, great fun to do. I don't, during the trout season here in Devon, I don't feel I need to do it. I don't need to rely on that as a way of catching fish. I will do it during winter time, but the rest of the time I don't tend to bother with it. So I don't feel I need to use it. I think that the fish will travel for a fly anyway, and like I say, my fishing's changed a little bit. I like to sit out a fish and see if I can see one rise, and then see if I can catch it. So I just find that fun. I think that's a function of me having a little bit more time now to enjoy fishing rather than guiding. So I think that's probably the reason behind it. But yeah, Maxia, really interesting rod, really fun to fish with too. So my last one, this is going to be, I hope it's not too emotional. I'm going back to Sage, but it's a rod I had for a while. It's a TXLF. It's a 7'10" 2-weight. And the reason I mention this one, I don't tend to fish it a great deal now, but I'm going to go back a little bit to when I was 49. And I had a day off from fishing or guiding, and I decided I was going to fish the River Bray, which I mentioned on the Mike Clark rod is named after. And I was driving over there, and there'd been a bit of water, and I thought I might swing some flies for some salmon. And I fished a few pools, got out, and then something really strange happened to me. It was as if somebody had got a cricket bat and ran probably 10 paces and hit me on the back of the head with it, on the top of the head. I can't quite remember now. And I sort of collapsed and could barely breathe. And I thought this was it. And I sat down and I said goodbye to my wife. I said goodbye to my daughter. I saw a sea trout pass as well on the river, and that's one of the last things I sort of remember. And I thought, I'll sit down here. This feels like it's it. It felt incredibly peaceful, I have to say. And I thought that would be it. But somehow an instinct took over, and the moment kind of passed. I don't know how long it was, and I managed to get to my feet. I managed somehow, I don't know how I did it, but I managed somehow to get to my car, and eventually I got home. And I couldn't work out what had happened. I had no idea what had happened, but I felt listless, I felt tired, and thankfully for my doctor, I ended up in hospital, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And then they took some scans, and I remember them doing the sitting on the edge of the bed because I was in hospital, and they said, you've had a massive brain hemorrhage. And it's a rare one, and it's one you're not supposed to survive. And it's called a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And it sort of took the wind out of my sails a little bit. And I was taken from there down to Plymouth, where the brain neurology department was. And it was funny, because I felt I'd sort of had been ill, and I was probably starting to get better. And so I was taken down to Plymouth, and I remember it was raining, and they kept taking my blood pressure and listening to me and everything else. And I'm saying, it's raining, there's going to be salmon, there's going to be salmon. That's what I could think about. And they took me into the hospital. They kept taking my blood. They kept taking my pressure overnight as well. And then the next day was probably one of the most frightening in my life, that they explained about what had happened, and they said, we're going to have to go and do a test now. And they took me up into a room and said, right, okay, if we find something else, we're going to have to put you under, and there's a 50% chance you will die during the procedure. Now, I'd not had the chance to speak to Emma. I couldn't do anything, and I've never kept my fingers crossed for so long, but thankfully I got through it. There was an anaesthetist standing there. They were ready just to put me under straight away if they found anything. And thankfully there wasn't. And after a period of time, they let me out and I came home. And it was almost sort of kind of euphoric in that, because I didn't really understand what had happened. And it was a really strange, surreal almost experience. And like I said, it was something you're not really supposed to come back to and be able to do the things that you could do previously. And I feel incredibly lucky for that. They told me it was the lifestyle that I led, and I thank fishing for that. And I think also that being able to still fish has driven me so much. And although I was doing the online magazine, I think this is how fly culture really came about, that fishing was almost taken from me along with many other things as well. And it just drove me on. And I went through a euphoric stage of fishing. And I remember, Emma will tell me, I can't really quite remember how long after I was out of hospital, but I was on the river and I caught a couple of salmon, and that was just extraordinary. And because what the hospital had said to me, they'd signed off and said, look, it may have been something you were born with. You may have had a whack on the head and it just exploded. The aneurysm just exploded and you somehow survived it. And so I just felt something that meant so much to me. I had to get out there and enjoy it and make sure it was still there for me. But the reason I mentioned this TXLF rod was that my friend Nick had been in contact. He said, I'm taking you trout fishing. And I said, look, all I want to do, and one of the side effects, and I still suffer from it a little bit now, still 6 years later, is that I get tired. And I said, look, I will come out for a little while. All I want to do is try and catch a trout on a dry fly. And we went to my home river, of course, the Tor, the upper river, on the River Tor Fishing Club water. And I tied on a dry fly, cast to a spot, and we were chatting, and I caught a fish. And it was a trout, and it wasn't the biggest trout, but it didn't matter. It was 6-7 inches long. It'd eaten a dry fly, and it meant everything to me. And I'm not afraid to admit that I cried. It was a really special moment for me. We hugged, Nick and I, and it was a really wonderful occasion. And that rod I will keep because of that very, very moment. And I know, talking about this, it almost feels, I don't really talk about this a great deal, but feel ready almost to. And I know everyone is going through stuff, and particularly through a difficult time like this, be it whatever, and everyone's having to deal with something. And that's what I've always tried to do with people, is look after them and be nice to them. And it doesn't take a lot to actually do that. And people are often dealing with stuff that we don't know about. And it's always nice to call somebody and check they're okay. And particularly during this difficult time that we've been through, or invite them fishing, or whatever that may be. But it's really nice for me to, in some respects, share that moment with you, because it was a pivotal moment in my life. It really was. And it does, we're really lucky that we go fishing. We're lucky we found this. And I don't know what I'd have done if I hadn't have survived in the same form that I have now. What I'd have been able to do without that. So I count myself incredibly lucky to be a fly angler and to know some wonderful people. There's so many people I've spent wonderful time on the water with, and try and share that. How I think, again, coming back to the magazine, that's part of the driving thing, is to share those moments and memories with people who feel the same as you do. So really, really special. Thank you for listening to that moment. I hope it wasn't too painful or uncomfortable or anything else. And as I said, my heart and thoughts are with lots of other people who are going through strange stuff and difficult stuff as well. So thank you for listening for that moment. That, I think, is my 10 rods. And that is a little insight into my life and how it's been so deeply shaped by fly fishing, and what fly fishing means to me, how fly fishing has saved me, how I've been able to teach people. One of the great things of having been a guiding instructor is hopefully a legacy of some sort, and that I've introduced so many people to fly fishing and got them to get it and to understand fly fishing and love it like I do. And that's been a wonderful journey to go on. And hopefully this stage of it now that I'm no longer doing it, I just couldn't do it anymore. I haven't got the energy to take people out every single day. And so I had to make that very difficult decision. It's not been as difficult as I thought. And our fishing school's with a wonderful guy now, Gerald, and he's got that and he's going great guns with that. And it's funny that I don't miss it in any way, shape or form at all. And I'm just enjoying going fishing, be it with the company of good friends, just be it if it's on my own, if it's with Emma when we're swinging flies for salmon. Every moment of it is special, and I hope you enjoy that as much as I do. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably do. But this has been a slightly different podcast again. As I said at the beginning, I just really like to take it in and explore different directions rather than go down a particular route. And if you've enjoyed this one, let me know, because I'm sure there's lots of other people I can speak to about their life in 10 fly rods. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this one. And there'll be, as ever, plenty more podcasts very, very soon.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.